it contrasted the fact, as I put it, that they'd been unable to rebuild their lives while football had rebuilt with £200 million public money in grants and gone off to make a fortune. And you've got to remember whenever you're talking about this, that this is about 96 people who went to a football match, just like all of us, who I presume just about everyone in here is a football fan. And one of the really important things about the inquest was that I think the 96 people who died, and a lot of survivors, because I think the numbers of people injured, a lot of them very, very seriously injured. I mean, there was a spectrum from minor abrasions right through to very serious brain damage that could have led to death, and the 96 who died. That they were reclaimed, and one of the brothers, someone who lost his brother, used that exact word. They made these personal statements at the beginning of the inquest about the 96, about the person they lost, about what they were actually like as people, and about how devastating it was to lose them. And some of them managed to slip in because it was all meant to be personal at that stage and non-so-called controversial. Some of them managed to slip in how traumatic it had been to have to fight for the truth and for justice for 27 years as well. So I think one of the really significant elements of this incredible process, 2 years, by far the longest case ever heard by a jury in British legal history, because the first inquest was the longest case ever heard by a jury in British history, and it was only 5 months. And this was 2 years, and as you've been hearing from the family's lawyers, they've been savaging the South Yorkshire Police and the other police barristers for doubling the length of time that it should have taken, because they took an adversarial approach again and tried to blame supporters again. And that's been the most traumatic and difficult thing for the families, the survivors, everybody involved who's known what's happening in there, that there was a chance that the jury would come out with a different answer to that question 7, and that after this whole justice process, the supporters could have ended up being blamed officially for the first time. And not to give our work a plug, but the personal statements were so powerful that I really wanted to make a permanent record of that, of the 96. And if you do go on the Guardian's website, we've done what's a face wall type treatment of it. And if you click on each person, I've done a summary of these incredibly moving statements that were made, which also brought those people to life and brought to life the love that the families had for them. And ultimately, these people have fought for them out of love and memory for the people who died. And it should never have happened, and we all know that. They should never have been traduced in the way that they were afterwards, which was, in many people's eyes, more shocking and unforgivable than the series of gross errors which led to the deaths in the first place. And after that, there was a further series of failures and cover-ups and whitewashes in the legal process, which meant that people have spent 27 years, half a life, a third of a lifetime. People have died. Many parents who lost their kids have died in the wait. And that should never have happened either. So the families are vindicated, and it's an extraordinary triumph of love and loyalty. But people have got to remember that all of these things should never have happened, and that all of these lessons should be learned.
Thank you, David. And as a result of the disaster, the SGSA, formerly the FLA, was formed. But now, as a result of these inquests, Ken, what does that mean for you and your team in your day-to-day work?
I think there is a stark and sobering reminder of what can go wrong if we don't all work together in an integrated fashion to deliver safety. I think it's reinforced significantly the importance of planning for an event, that planning can't be done in isolation. It's got to be done in collaboration with the other agencies. I think it highlights significantly the importance of the safety certificate process and the third-party accreditation, the oversight that gives on the safety of the venue. I think there is a message out there for those people who think that after 27 years without a disaster in the UK, that safety is now sorted. I think that I hope that this message will be a strong message to them. But if I look at it on a positive note, I think the fact that we've almost got 27 years of hindsight means that when we look back at the 76 recommendations of Lord Justice Taylor, there is a reassurance, and it's a reassurance without being complacent, that lots of the things that Lord Justice Taylor asked for have actually been acted upon. So we see brand new modern venues like the one we're in for this event today. We see good quality safety management teams that are led by safety officers who understand and know the workings of that venue. And we also hear, as we've heard many times in the presentations today, of the significance and the importance of the service element. That's the recognition of the fan. So it's not just about safety, it's not just about security, it's the introduction and the understanding of the needs of the fan and the realization that there isn't a one-size-fits-all.
You've both touched on the importance of the individual, the fan, and I think that's come through in a number of our sessions today. And the public perception of that fan now as an individual through the renewed interest in the inquests. And those inquests received a massive amount of media coverage. As a nation of sports fans, what do they mean more broadly for sports fans, do you think?
What, in the context of the inquests themselves, or?
How do we as sports fans move from this, and what have we learned from it? And do you think it will change the way that fans are, A, thought of, but B, think of themselves?
To be honest, at the moment, it's quite difficult for me to step out of the actual immediate details of the inquests themselves, because it's just been, it has been 20 years of writing about Hillsborough and writing about the Families Justice Campaign. Then it was 2 years of covering it, and it's just been an absolutely enormous impact, the verdicts themselves. And also I've felt like I need to stay in the saddle and keep whacking away at the South Yorkshire Police, which I hope I've done reasonably satisfactorily in the couple of weeks since. So in terms of kind of stepping out and learning and thinking of the wider lessons, for me, being so close to it still, I hope that one of the lessons is that people recognise who those people were then. And obviously, I would hope that now you do recognise the people that are at your football grounds are people. They're people with families. They're people that you have to look after. And as Ken said, that they're all individuals. And one of the terrible lessons of Hillsborough, and one of the reasons why the police were able to get away with traducing the people, and why the media, notoriously, not all the media actually, but why obviously most notoriously the Sun, which is probably the Sun's coverage on that Wednesday, 19th of April, under the heading The Truth, where each one of those allegations, like they were stealing from the dead. And I wrote a piece about this. It turned out that the police, as a routine, take a property log of any dead person. A police officer will look at what they've got on them and make a log of all the property on them. And all the 96 had cash, keys, their ticket. None of them were stripped bare, as one police officer actually said. And they were total lies. But one of the reasons, or the main reason, if you like, why they were able to get away with those lies was because there was a stereotyping, a caricaturing, a blackening of the name of football supporters in general. And we all know that there was some misbehaviour in those days, and there still is now. Like the police barristers at the inquest were trying to make out it was utterly horrendous then, and it's nirvana now. And people are sitting around playing chess before the teams come out. And they were saying they had to have segregation then, didn't they, in the 1980s? What happened was, for the misbehaviour of those people, all of football fans were caricatured and their names were blackened. And again, going back to the personal statements, they were talking about these people as individuals, and they came from all backgrounds. All backgrounds were behind the goal at that FA Cup semi-final, penned into that horrible place. And they were from all walks of life, so there were some, fairly wealthy people who lived in London and had a lot of money and went to private school, and there was somebody who'd grown up in care and whose sister had fostered him. There were people with fantastic jobs, like Peter Thompson was an engineer who'd worked at British Aerospace and had worked all around the world as an engineer, and there was one of them, actually only one, who was unemployed, a young guy who was unemployed. All different backgrounds, men, women and children, so many children because it was only £6 to get in. And that's why there were 37 teenagers there, mostly schoolboys. And I interviewed an officer from the South Yorkshire Police who was on duty that day. And I was talking to her about this, and I said, the personal statements, it was really interesting, wasn't it? There was graduates, professional people, and she said, I was really surprised about that. I was really surprised that there were, because our whole experience was just dealing with, the hooligans. And basically, we just thought that they all were. So in terms of the wider lesson, I know that that's, in many ways, hopefully that has been learned, and football supporters aren't regarded as that anymore. But just I know I'm going on a bit too long here, but just one final point about that to get across to you. What was really quite clear to me from the personal statements is not only were they basically all really good people, I mean, they weren't all angels, but you're not supposed to be all angels. No one expects everyone to be angels. But there were so many good people, and also what I realised is they're not just not hooligans and not the scum as the Sun painted them. Actually, they seem to be more likely to be pillars of the community. By being football fans, it meant that they were the kinds of people that did things together as a family. A lot of the dads were there with their kids. They were into sport, and that tended to mean they were into coaching and refereeing and being involved with things, and they were volunteers. And a lot of the boys were in the Scouts as well. And they were actually very active members of society, of which supporting football was one expression. So quite apart from being some kind of scum underclass, the people that are probably filling your stadiums now might well be more likely to be pillars of society than a random section of people.
Thank you, David. And just pushing a little further on some of the comments you made about the police and the 27 years it's taken to really show that those organisations who were meant to protect the public have lied to the public to protect their own reputation. What can the police do now to rebuild that trust, to re-establish a reputation as an organisation that protects people regardless of who that person is when they go to do something that they've paid money to do, that they enjoy, that is part of the wider life that you've talked about them having? Can they do anything?
Basically, they have to be radically different from how they were on that day and how they were then and how they've been for, far too long. And I'm not someone who is naturally mistrustful of the police or grew up on the wrong side of the tracks or was brought up to not respect the police. I totally was brought up to respect the police, and I would still trust the police when I needed them. I would hope that I would be, I would still want to be able to trust the police. But what we're talking about here is the institutional behaviour that was so toxic. And what happened there at the inquest was I was saying to the South Yorkshire Police, because in 2012 when they went through the disclosure process for the Hillsborough independent panel, the South Yorkshire Police was actually really responsible, and they handled that process well. They made full disclosure. They cooperated with the process. They said, we're not going to defend the failings of the past. We're a different force now. And then when the report came out, they made a full apology for the failings that had killed people and for what they said themselves were disgraceful lies. So I actually said to them, or to people at the South Yorkshire Police, I'd be happy at the end to do some coverage with you about what a different force you are and how much you've changed. And then what did they go and do? first of all, they've had a few other problems and issues, obviously at Rotherham and elsewhere, which are more modern. And so you couldn't cleanly say that. But they went to the inquest and tried to do the opposite of what they did in 2012. And they did get tangled up in trying to defend what happened in '89 and trying to blame the supporters. So they got themselves, as a modern force, toxically associated with defending the indefensible. So they have to make a clean break from that. And there's so many people in South Yorkshire Police saying, we're just not like that, honestly. There's so many good police officers. We are modern individuals. We do want to protect society. And I know being a police officer must be a very difficult job, and I'm not minimising that at all. And we are very grateful for them when they do the difficult work of keeping us safe. But they have to, that's the job. And they have to remember that's the job. And it's a very difficult thing in any job as well, that when things go wrong, you have to hold your hands up and admit it. And that's difficult too. But the failure to do that and the blaming of the victims has completely damaged the reputation of the police.
Thank you, David. And Ken, just thinking about what the inquests said and found in terms of the errors and omissions by the police, I wondered if you could talk us through in a bit more detail what that might mean, just to really illuminate some of those decisions, those things that were made. So just specifically, the features of the design and construction of the stadium, the errors in the safety certification and oversight, and maybe something around the pre-match and contingency planning, just to give us a bit more depth.
Yeah, I think the thing that came across most forcefully to me was around the fractured planning process. And I think, we look now, as I said, with the benefit of 27 years of hindsight, to see what a modern police force would be doing in terms of planning for a match. I think that whenever you plan for anything, it's important that you stick to that plan unless there's good reason to change. But I think equally as important is that you transcend that message through the different levels that you need to get to the grassroots to discharge the input or the outputs of that plan. I think what was evident was a lack of previous understanding of history. And I refer back to one of the striking comments for me from Lord Justice Taylor's report was that previous incidents hadn't been heeded, because there was lots of evidence out there to suggest that incidents like this had happened before. And
that was at Hillsborough and in football generally, wasn't it? That had crushes at Hillsborough and previous disasters in football.
And a fundamental part of any planning for any event is to debrief previous events. That's the first stage in the planning for the next event, to make sure that you don't replicate previous errors, omissions and problems. In terms of the planning, if you did that correctly, then you would see the foreseeable events, like football fans arriving 15 minutes before kickoff. Isn't something new, isn't something surprising. But you plan and you put measures in place to counteract and to deal with that. The other thing, which is very important in any planning, of course, is around the understanding of the geography of the site. What you can't do is come in to take control of any event, but not understand north, south, east, west, and the peculiarities, if there are any, of the venue. So that, again, is very, very important. And that's just not important in terms of when everything goes wrong. It should be important for things like general good customer care. Could you tell me which way it is to the visitors enclosure? How do I get to the car park? These are all good things that help to build up the communication between the event organizer, between the police and the fan that comes along to enjoy the event. A couple of things, a couple of binaries that stand out for me, and again, we're looking back 27 years, but it was the emphasis on the control rather than management. And I'd like to think now that we've flipped that now, and it is about managing crowds and understanding their needs. And it was also about reacting to problems and not being proactive to prevent the problem from occurring and arising in the first place. And I think the final thing in terms of the things that came to my mind for police submissions was around the fact that the control room that we see now very much as a multi-agency control room was more a police command centre. And so the safety officer wasn't there. And so I think that we've learned, in terms of the omissions that come out, I repeat what I said earlier, we get reassurance from that isn't the way that it's done now. In terms of the comment you asked me around the design and construction, I think what you've got to remember at the time of the Hillsborough disaster was that 58 out of the 92 Football League clubs were built during the period of 1890 and 1910. This is the Victorian era, often with facilities to match. Right? So this was a lack of investment in venues. Stadiums were segregated at that point to control fans, so we had pitch perimeter fences, we had pens that penned people in to prevent any movement and any cross-fertilization with other fans that are there. But there was a one-size-fits-all mentality applied. So the ideas around the demographic of fans being different, around crowd psychology wasn't understood at that time. So a venue that holds one type of event will need a different level of application for the same venue holding a different type of event. That principle, that fundamental that we accept now wasn't accepted at that time. But fundamental in any design and construction is setting a safe capacity. And that's understanding the balance between the entry, between the movement inside, between the actual physical holding capacity of the venue, and then looking at the egress. And if there are any imperfections in the design, then there should be a reduction in the overall safe capacity to reflect whatever that imperfection would be. In this case, we hear stories, we read stories around the failures of the barriers. The spacing of the barriers, the height of the barriers, the strength of the barriers.
The capacity was just, it was so wrongly calculated that the allowed capacity for each pen was twice as many people as the modern experts said it should have been, based even on the Green Guide then, and then they allowed 3 times too many people into it.
And that comes back to what I said earlier. It's about an understanding of the most important thing in any safety certificate. The cornerstone, the pillar of the Green Guide is setting and understanding the safe capacity. And that safe capacity is a mix of the 4 key ingredients. And if you don't get that, then you are walking down the path for future disaster. In terms of the third point you asked me was around safety certification. Clearly the certificate has got to set out a safe capacity, but that's not sufficient, because on its own the certificate has got to be a living, breathing document, right? It's got to be kept under review. That review should be at least annually. It should certainly should list any changes that have occurred at the venue. It should also list any near misses to reflect, could we do things differently? Can we ensure that this thing doesn't happen again? But the other bit is, and where we quite differ from where we were in 1989, is that we have an understanding that responsibility for safety lies with the stadium management. Because who better knows the venue than the stadium safety officer and his safety management team?
Thank you, Ken. That was a really comprehensive explanation of some of the stuff that's come out in the past 2 weeks. Certainly helped me understand it. My final question for today, David, what's next? And how can the families, if they can, move on from where we are today without forgetting the past or becoming complacent?
Well, what's next is that, that is only the inquest. And the main issue that the families have been campaigning against as an injustice, besides the original lies, if you like, and victim blaming in itself, was the fact that Lord Justice Taylor, in his first report, which was about the cause of the disaster itself, obviously saw through the lies. He to be honest, his report, which I consider to be an absolutely awesome piece of work, done only 4 months later, pretty much gave you what the jury has just come up with 27 years later. It was police mismanagement, the supporters weren't to blame, and he criticised the South Yorkshire Police for coming to his official inquiry and making that case, saying that it's depressing because it means that lessons may not be learnt, which is obviously very prophetic. But at the first inquest, the police just went back, they didn't heed what he'd said, and they made that case again, and we all know that it was a local coroner in Sheffield. He seems to have been very, very sadly in the pocket of the local police, or at least overly influenced by them. And it wasn't just the verdict of accidental death, it was just the whole course of the inquest was an appalling experience for the families. So what happens now is that they've got an unlawful killing verdict, but there are 2 massive criminal investigations going on, which are filling a whole office block, 5-storey office block in Warrington, overseen by the Independent Police Complaints Commission. And one is into possible manslaughter and other criminal offences that led to 96 people dying at a football match, of which, it's not giving away some kind of golden information to think that David Duckenfield is, obviously under serious risk of being prosecuted. But there are a number of other, as they say, organisations and individuals who are under investigation, and they've confirmed, this is called Operation Resolve, is that police investigation. They've confirmed that Sheffield Wednesday are, they've confirmed that the FA is, and they've confirmed that obviously the South Yorkshire Police and officers within it, and individuals within those organisations. Then the second criminal investigation is by the IPCC itself, and that's into what is alleged to have been the cover-up afterwards, which, to be honest, to me, there's 2 parts to that. Only one part of it is a cover-up, which sounds like, something that's happening secretly, because a lot of it was right there in your face. It was just an orchestrated campaign publicly to blame victims. But because a lot of that was clearly false, like, for example, the people who fed the stories to the Sun, which were false, which were lies, there is a criminal investigation into which police officers gave false information to the media, which could be misconduct in a public office, and it could be an attempt to pervert the course of justice. And they've said specifically that those are 2 of the criminal offences and perjury in terms of sworn statements and evidence given in court. And the costs of those 2 investigations are already £70 million. And they're estimating that they're going to spend another £10 million before they send files to the CPS at the end of this year. £80 million. Criminal investigation, 27 years later, to a completely avoidable devastation that happened because people didn't follow some of the basics, which I'm not saying that your jobs are easy at all, and I've got very great respect for you if you're keeping people safe week in, week out, but not following the basics of the job has led to this devastation. And to be honest, this ongoing cost. And so for the families, to be honest, that is what happens next. And it's not a vengeful thing. And you don't hear any of them saying, I want them locked up and the key to be thrown away. You don't hear that. What you hear from them is, we want accountability. We never had any accountability. We just had denial. And that's why they want it. And our system, there are some people, even within The Guardian, saying, should they really be prosecuted, and won't they all just defend themselves again? And isn't it just a risk that they'll blame, to try and get out of it, they'll blame supporters again? But that's our system. I'm not a great defender of the criminal justice system, but that is our system for allocating accountability when people have died and gross failings have taken place. So they're expecting to send files to the CPS by the end of this year, and expecting the CPS to make a decision this time next year on who to charge. And after £80 million been spent, I think it's unlikely that people think they've done the jobs if there's no prosecutions.
Thank you, David and Ken. I want us to keep going with this, but I'm afraid that is all we have time for to talk about this subject. And thank you both for being so frank and honest, for sharing what must have been an emotional experience, and for really giving us an understanding of what those 96 families went through and still go through, but the opportunity they now have to talk about accountability without being tarnished as a result. Ken, thank you for really explaining to us what that means, but also reassuring us that the lessons have been learnt in terms of the practical stuff you guys do on a daily basis, and that no one in this room is being complacent at all. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking David and Ken. Thank you. Let's go and take a seat.